January 2021. I am the Chairman, Councillor Cyril Liddy. This meeting is being broadcast live via Zoom over the internet on the Council's YouTube channel and will be available to watch afterwards. To begin the meeting, there are a few matters of housekeeping. With the exception of the Democratic Services officers advising us, would all participants please mute their microphones unless invited to speak? At the start of the meeting, I will announce by name and invite those participants wishing to make representations to the committee in the order of the business to be conducted. I will ask for the application to be presented by the planning case officer, during which time a visual presentation will be shared. I will ask members of the committee in turn if they wish to ask a question or comment. At the end of each item of business, the Democratic Services officer will ask each committee member in turn to confirm audibly how they wish to vote, and the outcome of each vote will be confirmed by the DSO. Subject to progress of the meeting, I may adjourn it at 8 p.m. for a short break. This is a quasi-judicial committee which makes its decisions based on material planning considerations following the laws of the land and the policies of the council. If the committee is minded to refuse an application, members will use such considerations and evidence that will stand up in a court of law. The material planning considerations are listed in the committee's agenda. Now I will ask each committee member to introduce them in turn. I won't ask you to confirm that you understand the process, because I think all of you, apart from Councillor Davidson, have done it often enough. Councillor Barton, please.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Lynn Barton, Shrub End Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Chua, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Helen Chua, St Anne's and St John's Ward. Thank you.
Councillor Hazel.
Councillor Pauline Hazel, Shrub End Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Davidson, please.
Councillor Davidson from Mersey and Pyfleet Ward. I'm substituting for Brian Jarvis. Councillor Brian Jarvis.
Thank you. Councillor Loveland.
Yes, Councillor Loveland from Tiptree Ward.
Councillor McLean, please.
Councillor Jackie McLean from Markstown Lair Ward.
Councillor Oxford.
Councillor Jarrod Oxford, Highwoods Ward, substituting for Councillor Philip Oxford. Thank you.
Councillor Warnes, please.
And Councillor Martin Warnes, representing Beerchurch Ward.
Councillor Davidson, are you comfortable with the process? Do you have any questions?
Yes, thank you, Chairman.
Jolly good. Okay, the substitutes for this evening are, as said, Councillor G. Oxford, Councillor P. Oxford, and Councillor Davidson for Councillor Jarvis. There are no urgent items scheduled for this meeting. Are there any declarations of interest, disclosable pecuniary, other pecuniary, non-pecuniary, that councillors wish to say? No? Right, have your say. We have only one item of substantive item on the agenda this evening, and that is for the erection of a two-storey front and rear extension, increased width and side box dormer. We have the presenting officer is Chris Harden. Speaking against for the public is Catherine Norris. I have no speakers for the application, and visiting councillor, Councillor Sue Lissimore. So I will now invite, I'll invite Catherine Norris, please, to address the committee, please.
Good evening, everyone. I represent the views of the new neighbours in Lexton Grove and Colvin Close, who are largely affected by this proposed planning application. When my late husband and I moved into 5 Lexton Grove in 1997, number 7 was a modest 4-bedroomed house like a number of others on the development. It has been considerably extended in recent years, doubling in size, with a 2-storied extension to the south and a single story on the north boundary. Further extension, as proposed, is an overdevelopment for the limited size of the site, completely out of scale with all the other properties on similar sized plots in Lexton Grove and Colvin Close. We would like you to note that we have no objection to any single story extension to the rear, only the upper story. The properties particularly affected are mine, 5 Lexton Grove, and that of an elderly retired couple, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas at number 6 Colvin Close, on the north and eastern boundaries of 7 Lexton Grove, respectively. Our main objections are the severe loss of amenity, privacy and light by the 2-story rearward extension. It will extend the building by some 12 foot into the garden, halving its current distance from the western boundary, 6 Colvin Close, and bringing it to only some 14 foot from their fence. This means that the 2-story face of this extension would intrusively dominate the western boundary and closely overlook the patio and garden of number 6 Colvin Close, and it will significantly impact on the privacy and amenity of both properties. The overlooking would be further exacerbated as the first floor window of the extension is wider than the current one and no less than twice the height, at some 6 foot or 2 meters. It will be very intimidating. I work from home and I use my garden a lot. I grow a lot of my own food, I've dug a wildlife pond, and I often sit outside. The extension will overshadow my vegetable plots, and the double height window in the upper story will overlook an impact on my privacy. Light in Lexton Grove is already compromised by an oak tree, which cuts up some of the sun, and the 2-story extension will make my east-facing kitchen, a bedroom, the patio and garden lose light. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas, as an elderly retired couple, are mostly at home and value the privacy and utility of their garden a great deal. This rear 2-story extension will present an ugly cliff of brick, tile and window along some 2/3 of the applicant's northern boundary, visible from both number 5 Lexton Grove and from number 6 Colvin Close. It will loom over our rear gardens and seating areas and spoil the use and enjoyment of our homes and gardens. That's it.
Thank you. Councillor Lissimore, would you care to address the committee, please?
Thank you. Hope you can hear me okay. I do appreciate you allowing me to speak this evening. I'm very appreciative of your time. As you would have heard from the residents' representatives, this is an incredibly large extension on a property that has already been extended in years gone by. Hopefully you can see by the photographs that you should have been sent that this extension will be incredibly intimidating for its neighbours. Paragraph 16.2 of the agenda states that the planning officer believes the extensions are acceptable. There is no argument now about the front extension as it has been reduced. All comments are now about the rear extension. Whilst it is stated the rear extension would not be prominent in the street scene, it is certainly very prominent from neighbouring properties. And I disagree with the statement that the dormer does not appear overscaled or visually dominating on the roof. It is also stated that the extension would not be unduly visually dominant nor detrimental to the character of the surrounding area. I also disagree with this statement, and the photographs that the neighbour has supplied, I think, show how dominant this extension would actually be. As in paragraph 16.4, I do not believe that this proposal complies with local plan policy DP1, as it does not enhance the site and the scale is out of context with other buildings and is too dominant. Paragraph 16.6 states the new extension projection is only 3.6 metres beyond the rear wall of the neighbouring property. However, this gap that it is filling is the main area of light coming into the adjoining garden. If that gap is blocked, then there will be very little direct sunlight, especially in winter. It will only be in the height of summer that direct sunlight will be shining into the neighbour's garden. In planning terms, a 3.6 metre increase may be classed as modest, but it has a huge detrimental effect in neighbouring gardens. There are also no concerns at loss of light. Neighbours disagree. The full-length windows that are floor to ceiling at the rear of the extension are particularly intimidating for the neighbours. Whilst there is already a much smaller window much further away in the existing building, this new extension brings the window far closer to neighbours' properties, and with the increase in size makes it far more imposing and a greater loss of privacy. Because of the size of the windows being floor to ceiling, it enables anybody looking out of them to see the whole depth of neighbours' gardens, rather than a distant and smaller proportion with the windows that are installed at present. Paragraph 16.7 dismisses this as being too far away. Neighbours disagree. It may be a standard arrangement to be overlooked, but not with a window that is so large, nor one far closer to the boundary than the existing. The pitch roof that you will see from the doctored photographs again produce a very intimidating view from neighbours' gardens, and not only blocks the small amount of light that is available, but also creates a blocked-in feeling in neighbours' gardens. The little cul-de-sac has already experienced many extensions, and whilst I appreciate that each one has to be taken on its own merits, this extension seems to be a step too far in that it is overpowering, overbearing, and making the area claustrophobic. Local residents in the area are asking that this application is declined tonight, and the applicant works with the planning officer to reduce the size of the rear extension to stop it taking over the neighbourhood, blocking light, as they believe that a better design could give the applicant what they require, but also not have such an intimidating presence upon this cul-de-sac. If this application is to be approved this evening, I would like to ask on behalf of the neighbours that the size of the windows I looked at and reduced to around the same size that exists at the moment. Whilst this is not what neighbours want, it would still be an overpowering extension. If the application is to be approved, this would reduce the intimidating, overbearing windows that are planned at present, would alleviate a little the prospect of being overlooked. Thank you.
You're muted, Cyril.
Chairman, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Lismore. If Mrs. Norris would be good enough to leave the meeting, you may watch the proceedings on the Council's YouTube website.
Background noise from somebody. There's lots of background noise. It's really difficult to hear. Oh.
Chairman, you're muted.
The next item on the agenda are the minutes of the meeting held on the 10th of December. Do we need to take a roll call for that, or are we quite happy to just simply agree? Richard? All right, if we...
Chairman, yeah, there's no need to take a formal roll call. You can take a formal indication.
Okay, are we all agreed on that? Yes?
Agreed.
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 Okay.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. That's agreed unanimously then. Right, we now move on to the planning application, and the case officer is Chris Harden. Chris, if you'd be good enough to address the committee, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Okay, I'll share the presentation. Just bear with me. Sorry, Chairman, it's not letting me share.
Chris, would you like me to share it and you just talk to it?
Yes, if you can do, yes. It's not sharing the right screen for me.
Is it showing now?
Yes. Yes, if you could just enlarge it, please.
Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine. Okay, so the application is for the, sorry, could you just go back to two-story, go back to the description, please, and I'll tell you when to move on. So it's a two-story front and rear extension. There's an increased width of the box dormer, and there's also a porch. Next slide, please. This shows the application site in red there, and the property is situated roughly centrally within the plot, although there's obviously a larger rear garden. Note all the other properties to the rear and next to it. Next, please. Hopefully you can see that. This shows basically at the top the existing proposal, and I've got some larger slides that will come up, but essentially there is a front extension. You may just be able to make it out in red at the bottom of the screen, but I think we'll go to the next slide and there should be some clearer. That's right. So basically at the top is the front of the property, and the bottom of the screen is the rear of the property. So at the front, you've got this front extension coming out where the existing garage is. I'll show you some photographs in a minute. That's been reduced from the initial submission, as outlined in the committee report, and the stilted arrangement that was in the original application has also been omitted. So I'll show you the elevations in a second, but that's the revision in that respect. And then the rear elevation, the element in red at the bottom of the screen to the right is the first floor extension going over an existing single story extension. And to the left, bottom left, you can see two little red lines. That's the additional single story element. So not much single story addition at the rear, and to the rear right, the first floor extension. Next slide, please. This essentially is a closer view of the site. You see the boundary to the right is the rear boundary, and you'll see that that's the distance that the proposal would be from the rear boundary. Next, please. If you can just scroll down a little bit on that, that'd be. Okay, no, you can't. Okay, so basically, if you look at the bottom of the screen, to the right shows the extension coming out at the front, on the front elevation. Then the bottom far right drawing shows the extension to the rear, which is to the rear right. You'll see, it's a shame I can't use my pointer. I presume you can't see my pointer. The element to the rear right is the first floor extension, and you'll see the bifold doors. That's the extra single story extension. The drawings at the top of this screen show the existing dwelling as it is. So if you look at the middle one, you'll see that existing single story element to the rear there. That's where the extension at the rear is going to be positioned. So if you can just go, it's not very good light for me here. Now if you look to the second, that's right, just to the right of your cursor, you'll see that element to the rear of that extension. That is where the first floor extension is going to go. So that's to the right-hand side. You'll be able to compare the drawings with the drawing above. So that's right, that's the element there that's coming, being positioned. And then if you go to the drawing to the far right of that line, you'll see where the cursor is, that's the extension coming off the rear of the property. So essentially it's covering the existing ground floor extension to the rear. Hopefully that is clear for you. If you need me to explain that again, I can do. So front and rear extension, you'll note there's a little dormer. If you look at the rear elevation, there's a dormer within the building is being extended out. That's the area where we want that to be obscure glazed so it doesn't look sideways, basically. If you just go to the next slide, please. You can come back to those drawings if you need to. This is an aerial view of the plot. That's Lexton Grove. And you'll see the properties number 5 at the top of that slide. And then property to the rear, some vegetation there. You'll see a conservatory, a white conservatory property to the rear. Next, please. This is a view taken before the applicant's conservatory was replaced by a single-storey extension. So that's that white conservatory. This is an aerial view. It gives a bit of a clearer picture at the time of the that aerial photograph was taken. Next slide, please. This is the view of the street scene. So you'll see at the end of the property where the garaging is, that's where the front extension is going to go. Next, please. And this is looking at the front of the property. You can see the extension is going to extend that element to the left of this frontage property. Note the rear vegetation at the time of that was taken in the summer. Next, please. A lot of photographs to get through, but I think they are necessary in this case. That's another view showing the neighbouring property in proximity. Note there is a gap between the two properties. Next, please. That's a view at the front of the site. Note the garage there and the neighbour to the front right. Next, please. That's a street scene view from near the application site. Next, please. That's a view looking at the parking areas opposite the application site. That's basically a turning head for the street. Next, please. This is the view at the rear of the property. So the extension will basically come as far as the end of that single-storey element. Note the existing rear window in the bedroom at first floor, and then the single-storey extension will extend further this way, away from this existing single-storey extension. Next, please. That's a view of the rear of the property and also showing the neighbouring property. This shows where the extension will go above the single-storey extension. You'll note the gaps between boundaries, note neighbouring windows. Next, please. That's a view looking back across from the applicant site towards the neighbour on the other side. Next, please. This is the view close up of the neighbouring property to the right as you look at it from the rear. Note the windows in the rear elevation. Next, please. This is the view showing the gap between those two properties. So there is a gap on the applicant's side and also a gap on the neighbour's side. Next, please. So another view of the gap. If you can go back to that one, please. So that's a view of the gap. You'll see vegetation to the rear as well, and the end of the existing single-storey extension. Next, please. It's another view of the proximity of the neighbours and the rear vegetation. Next, please. That's a view of the rear boundary taken in the summer. There's a rear oak tree and some other lighter vegetation. Next, please. This is a photograph taken from the applicant's bedroom. I had to get someone to cover that photograph. I must admit they've chopped off a key element of the bit I wanted to show, but you can see the rear boundary fence here, this existing picture. You can see the rear property. There is some vegetation at the rear, but it certainly in winter there's less vegetation than appeared in the original site visit. The neighbour's conservatory is just beyond. There's a little green bit of vegetation you see at the end of that roof. Neighbour's conservatory is just beyond that, so that gives an impression of views. But I must admit the person who just had to download this picture into the SharePoint has taken off a bit of the top of the photograph, which showed how much you can see, which is a bit of a shame, to be honest. So I couldn't download it in my system. We'll go to the next photograph and see what that shows. Okay, that's a slightly better view. You'll see there are some opening gaps to the rear right of that photograph above the fence to allow some view into the neighbour's garden, and then the view over to the left of the neighbouring property there. So that's essentially the current view. Next photograph, please. That shows a more distant view, set back from the neighbouring property, showing the current view over that neighbouring property to the rear. See, there is some planting, but there's also sort of trellis and the conservatory to the left. Next view, please. That gives a better view if you can remember, in conjunction with the other photograph showing the current boundary. Certainly as I said, in winter it looks more open on that boundary than it did when I first visited the site. There may have been some vegetation taken out, unless it is just the fact that vegetation is off the trees. But I'll cover that issue later in my presentation. Next photograph, please. That probably gives the best view from the rear window at the moment. As you can see a bit of the conservatory and some of the neighbouring garden. That does foreshorten it, I must admit. So you need to remember that in conjunction with the previous photographs. Next, please. That's a straight-on view of the rear boundary. That's quite a good indication. Next view, please. That's a view across the garden of the application property. Sideways. Next, please. Another view of the corner. That does actually give a good impression of the distance, because the single-story extension is not quite in view on this one. Next, please. Another rear straight-on view. Next, please. That's a view looking towards the neighbour, the other side, relatively well screened. Next, please. Reminder of the street view. Next, please. Looking back. Next, please. This is a copy of the letter that was sent in by the applicant, sorry, not the applicant, the neighbour, the latest objection. You've seen a copy of that, but just to reiterate that there are strong objections from the neighbour in terms of loss of privacy and overbearing impact, and the domination of the western boundary, as discussed, presented by the neighbour. There's also overlooking concerns. If you, yes, next, please. These are the photographs sent in by neighbours. So this is a view from the neighbouring property to the rear. It shows a view across the fence, across the conservatory, and the extension will be above the single-storey extension in line with the existing 1.5-storey first floor element there. So that gives an impression of where it's going. Next, please. That's a view submitted by the neighbour showing the resultant extension. I can't verify the accuracy of this, but I don't think it is far off. So that gives a good indication. Several things to note here. The distance from the property to the rear right of the main ridge. So you see it is quite a distance from the side boundary. So it obviously doesn't start on the boundary. If it was a 2-storey extension, that would be a different issue, but it is essentially 1.5-storey in the roof. Note the larger windows as well, as pointed out by the neighbour. And those are obviously nearer to this rear boundary than existing windows. Next photo, please. That's another view sent in by a neighbour. So that shows a view of the application site from the neighbour's property. You'll see the single-storey element and the rear flank. And then the next photograph will show the difference. Again, I can't verify the accuracy of this, but it does seem quite accurate to me. So if you can just go back one and then forward one. So that shows the element that is proposed to be added. Next photograph, please. This is just some previous planning history. You'll note the previous application in 2010 showed an addition to the rear there. That's that single-storey element. That replaced the conservatory. Next, please. And finally, in terms of the history, this basically shows what was added previously on the other side by the garage. Essentially, it was an extension to the, if you look at the property from the front to the right, covering some of the original garage and making a 1.5-storey element there. So to the right of the property, as you look at it from the front, there was that 1.5-storey extension in 2005. I think that's the last of the slides. If you can just check what the next one is, please. No, that's it. So if you just go back to a rear view of the property, please, in photograph forms, and I'll carry on with my presentation. Keep going back to, I think that's, yeah, I'll keep going back, yep. Back more. Okay, leave that one there, please. If you could leave that one you had there, please. Thanks. Yep. Okay. So I'll go through the planning considerations now. So in terms of the principle of the application, the property lies within the settlement limits of the borough, so the proposal should be judged on its planning merits. In terms of design, scale and form, the proposal is considered acceptable. The front element has been reduced, and now the existing one is in keeping with the character of the existing property. It is not a very forward projecting element, only projects about 3.8 metres. It still reads as being recessive to the original dwelling. It allows enough car parking to retain, which we retained in the front of the site, so there'll be 2 spaces retained. So it's not considered that element will have any real detrimental impact upon the character of the street scene. It does blend in nicely with the existing dwelling. So we're now happy with that revision to the scheme. In terms of the rear extension, this is not going to be prominent in the street scene. It's the same height as the original rear element, so it'll blend in terms of its scale and form. The detailing is in keeping, so it will not detract in any way from the street scene, and it does relate well to the character of the dwelling. The single-storey element is going to sit very quietly to the rear of that property and is considered to be an appropriate design, and the same applies to the porch, which will sit quietly on the front of the property. So overall, the application in terms of design, scale and form is considered to conform with planning policy DP1. We now turn to the impact on neighbouring residential amenity. This is obviously a very important factor and has been looked at in great depth on sites. There have been 2 site visits. I revisited the site again in winter to check out the vegetation along the boundaries. So I visited it in the summer and in winter. So in terms of the rear extension, the impact on the side neighbour, it's considered that that is not going to be have an overbearing impact upon the neighbour in a significant way. It complies with planning policy standards, a 45-degree wall. It'll be a continuation of the rear element of the property, and so there will be a distance from the neighbour's boundary. There is a gap between the application proposal and the application site boundary, and then the neighbour's dwelling is also a bit away from the boundary. So it does quite easily accord with the standards that we use for assessing loss of light and overbearing impact. And those are standards applied by the Borough Council and recommended by the Essex Design Guide. So the proposal in that respect fully accords with the standards we work to. That makes it difficult for me to recommend it unfavourably. I've assessed it, looked at it very closely from all angles, and that's the conclusion that is reached. In terms of the rear boundary, the proposal is considered to be far enough away from the property to the rear to avoid an overbearing impact. The distance from the rear boundary would be approximately 8.6 metres. So there is a significant difference, a distance from the rear element to the rear boundary. There is some screening on that boundary, but in winter it looks less than in summer. And as I say, whether there was some vegetation removed, I don't know, but in my opinion, the actual potential overlooking is marginal. We have lost appeals on overlooking on similar distances, and it would only look over a certain amount of garden, which frankly is already overlooked. But nevertheless, there are ways to get around that overlooking if the councillors are concerned about that. Several ways really. You can reduce the size of the new window, or you can obscure glaze it up to a height of 1.7 metres above floor level. So those are the options. You could have a condition about some additional planting on the rear boundary. You could have one of those options, or you could have them in combination. But I think it is marginal to insist on those options. But you know, if that is required, then there is potential to do that. Overall, there is it's not considered. I can recommend refusal on grounds of impact on neighbouring residential amenity from this rear first floor extension. You'll note that I'm recommending a condition on the side dormer that's being extended. That's within. This is to the left of this element. It's not the dormer to the right, it's to the left within the courtyard of the property. That dormer will have obscure, make sure it doesn't overlook the neighbour on the other side. So that will make sure there's not overlooking that way. Okay, so turning to other issues, there are 2 car parking spaces retained at the front of the site, and that will accord with our parking standards. In terms of the retaining garden, the extension will mean this property is going to be a 4-bedroom dwelling. At the moment, it is a 3-bedroom dwelling because of the way it's arranged internally and with the ensuite bathroom. Yeah, family, so there is a pressing need for this bedroom, and approximately 160 square meters. Now that is still quite a substantial area, and that does exceed the standards required for a 4-bedroomed property, which equates to 100 square meters. So standard is 100 square meters, amenity space retained 160 square meters. So it is quite a significant plot. Finally, in terms of impact on vegetation, the extensions avoid any impacts on trees in the vicinity, including the preserved tree at the front of the site. It's a relatively small area of additional building on ground level, so there won't be an impact on vegetation. So in conclusion, the proposal is considered acceptable in terms of its design, scale and form. In terms of residential amenity, that has been considered very carefully, and it meets our standards in terms of overbearing impact and loss of light. Conditions can be implemented to mitigate any overlooking if that is considered necessary, and the conditions can be put forward as outlined in the committee report. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chris. Good, right. I will now ask each committee member if they wish to comment or ask questions. Councillor Barton, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for a very thorough presentation, but I do have concerns. It's the first time actually since that I've felt disadvantaged with this current situation. As a site visit for me would have been extremely helpful to actually see the piece of land. But what I'm worried about, in proportion to the size of the overall plot, which wasn't as big as I was expecting it to be, are these extensions disproportionate? That's the consideration, isn't it, really? And secondly, you're saying the extension will overshadow the vegetable area of the neighbour's garden, but you're also saying that it does meet legal requirements with the amount of light that will be lost. I just want confirmation of that. Yeah, I mean, I think the whole thing looks a bit cluttered, to be honest, but I'll hear what other people have to say. That's all I've got to say at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Chua, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I have to say I agree with what Councillor Lynn Barton has said. The front, is well, okay, for me with the reduced, size. It's the back, the oversize, of what's going to be built on top of that single story, and in view of the windows as well, that if possible, to reduce the size of the windows because of the overlooking. And I haven't made up my mind about it because it's difficult at the moment. So I'll wait to see what the other councillors have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hazel, please.
Thank you, Chair. I do agree with what has been said thus far. I did notice on one of the photographs that there was a dappled shade on the wall quite high up of the next door neighbour. And with that building being extended, that shade will be clearly taken further into the neighbour's garden. From what I've seen and I know the area quite well, I just think it's the extension is far too big for the plot on which it stands. I also think it does not comply with DP1. I think the extension at the back is most unattractive. and for neighbours to have to look out on that, whether they have obscure glass or not, to me, it's no, I'm not happy with that at all. Again, like the previous, like Councillor Chua and Councillor Barton, I'd like to see hear what other people say, but I'm not at all convinced that this is a worthwhile value for the plot of the neighbours. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Ordinarily, I would ask Chris to answer those questions, but I think there seems to be an emerging trend here or theme. So I will press on, and you can answer them at the end, if that's all right. Councillor Davidson, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Like the other councillors, I'm concerned that having had multiple extensions already, this is really a case of overdevelopment, and more so because it affects the immediate neighbours. I just wondered, Mr. Harden, if we could go back to the drawings of the plan with the red lines on it. I'm just wondering if we could reject this one and actually get them to reapply for an extension on the western side, which would actually encroach on their sun and garden, but not on the neighbours. But I agree with Councillor Chua that the window on the second floor is far too big. I would encourage it to be opaque if possible, because mainly any planting screen would take years to give any privacy for the neighbours. And it would be in control of the applicant, and there's nothing to stop him cutting it down to a 4 or 5 or 6 foot tall. The other concern I've got is that when Mrs. Norris gave her presentation, she mentioned that the single rear extension is going out by 12 foot, and that leaves only 14 foot from the rear boundary with number 6 Colvin Close. That's only 4.3 meters. That's only the length of a small car. So I really do think it's overdevelopment. And the other thing that concerns me is that you've got, bear with me, I've my notes. Oh yes. The other thing that concerns me is that what happens with those large windows upstairs if they put a balcony on at a later date, which I think they can do with permitted development. That would absolutely overlook both number 5 and number 6. So I'd encourage, if we were granting permission, to remove permitted development rights to make sure that it wasn't extended further within their permitted extensions. Mr. Harden, you also mentioned about the size of the recreation space. I presume that's the front and rear garden you've measured. Well, the front, of course, is full up of cars. The rear garden, you mentioned 160 square meters, but then you mentioned a 4-bedroom. We're proposing here a 5-bedroom house. So, you know, does it conform with the adequate size recreation space with a 5-bed? I'll leave it at that for now, Chairman, but I'm certainly not comfortable with it.
Thank you. Councillor Loveland, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'd like to agree with our other councillors, and what they've brought up is fantastic, especially Robert Davidson. His idea of swapping it from side to side was, I think, inspired. I thought many years ago when I first started in the building game in the late 70s that you weren't allowed to build more than 25% of the original size of the house. I don't know whether that rule still applies or it's disappeared or whatever, but I do feel it's just totally overbuilt, the whole site. I think it's ridiculous. Thank you.
Chris, could I ask you just to clear up that one point, because I believe the rules have changed over the years as to the size of the footprint that can be developed. Can you just deal with that one point before we move on to the next? You're muted.
Okay, Chairman, there are other points I need to get back on because there's been some inaccuracies stated. But,
all right, so do you want to wrap them up then? Okay.
Okay, yeah, firstly, Councillor Davidson seems to, there are a lot of inaccuracies there, to be honest. Firstly, I've calculated that the distance from the rear boundary of the rear extension is going to be 8.6 metres, which is, that's more than, you know, the 14 feet. That's, you're talking about over 20 feet. So I think that was shown in the photograph. So it's, yeah, you're talking about 24 feet, basically. So I think the neighbour has miscalculated that. And I don't think I've miscalculated it because I measured it pretty carefully. So obviously you didn't need to make the decision on the correct facts. Then in terms of the garden space, that is just rear garden space. I calculated that on. It doesn't include the front garden space. That's the rear garden space. And yes, we can remove PD rights. That'd be a good idea. And then just on the point you made about the 25% rule, that has not been a rule for development in settlement limits since I've been a planner. I've only been at Colchester for 6 years, but it hasn't been a rule at Colchester in that time. It certainly wasn't a rule at my other authority. So it might be a rule in rural areas. It could well have been a rule in, you know, countryside, but not. It's certainly not a rule in urban areas now, and hasn't been since I've been at Colchester Borough, and I've never seen a rule in the urban areas for that. So no, it's not a rule, but you know, you obviously do need to consider whether development is overdevelopment. So that's what I'd like to say at the moment, but I can make a few more points later on about the other comments.
Please, if you could. Actually, before we return to the councillors, Simon, are you able to clarify that point? Because I think I certainly have it in the back of my mind that there is a percentage size, and although it's changed over the years.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, in terms of percentage, that many moons ago was used in rural areas, and particularly in A and B, but has never really applied within the development boundary, and particularly not within a suburban area. There is no hard and fast percentage in urban areas, and to be honest, there never has been. Certainly not in 30 odd years of planning that I've known anywhere in the country. Sorry, I don't think, I think that's probably a bit of folklore there that may have applied in rural areas outside development boundaries at some time in some parts of the country, particularly in metropolitan greenbelt and places like that. Sometimes extremely restrictive extensions have been permitted in such areas.
Are we thinking about this rule that was introduced with the Town and Country Planning Act of 1948? There was definitely a limit to the amount that you could extend a property.
There is, in terms of permitted development, Chair, there obviously were and remain parameters under the GPDO, but in terms of hard and fast extensions policy, it does obviously depend on the size of the property, the size of the plot, and the character.
So in other words, area is not to be confused with that permitted under the permitted development rights. Okay, right. I think I've got that in my head. Councillor McLean, please.
Thank you, Chair. I did do a site visit this afternoon. I thought it would be very interesting if it's just down the road from me, and it is quite interesting. The house is a very nice house. It looks quite large at the end of the little cul-de-sac, and it is very close to its neighbours. I'd say it's almost sort of 2 and a bit metres apart from wall to wall. Must be 2.3 or something. And from the top dormer to the neighbouring property, gosh, if you're both in the same room, you could hear each other speaking, I would have thought. But I mean, it does seem terribly close for the extension at the back on the boundary line, or on the same line as the conservatory. They're going to be able to almost look into the neighbouring window, which I thought was, quite a concern. But if you're saying that's acceptable in planning terms, then that's very interesting. The parking at the front worries me a little bit because there is a turning recess up there on the end of the road. But I noticed there's cars parked in there from obviously the photographs that Chris Harden's taken. And today when I was there were cars parked and there were 3 cars on the front of the drive. Now, if you're taking away the garage forecourt space parking, maybe they're not going to have enough parking on this site unless they take away all the greenery from the front of the site. I would like to know how that's all going to work out, or if they, I mean, the whole road had cars parked all the way up on the side. So there is very limited space in here. And I wouldn't say they're all going into town because obviously nobody is at the moment and they're all working from home. So I think we might be overloading the whole road at the moment, but that may not be a planning consideration. I'm really concerned with the design of the property so close to the neighbour, and I think the I know it's not on the table, but I'm wondering if we could get someone to go back and speak to the occupier to see if it could be readjusted to the other side. I would think would be so much more acceptable and pleasing to everybody. So as I stand, I cannot support this application on the size of it, on the lack of privacy to the neighbours, and I think it's unfair, and that's not a planning consideration, I know, but I just think it's too big, too overbearing for where it's going to go. So I cannot support this, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Councillor Oxford, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I looked with interest. I mean, obviously I read all the agenda and so on, but then looking at all the photographs and so on, I have some real concerns. Let's go first from the front. They're extending the front section out where the garages are, which is going to reduce down the number of available parking spaces. And if you've got a property that's at least 4 bedroom, and Robert said it could be 5, I don't know in my ward any 4 bedroom property that hasn't got at least 4 cars, sometimes more than that. So to think that they would only have 2, somebody's been sniffing something, I think, that's not of kosher substance. I think the size and bulk of this is way out of character with the rest of the road. Very, very close to the neighbouring properties, I thought. I know it was said about separation, but the separation between the immediate next door neighbour with the garden plot and the planting didn't seem to me to be very wide. I thought probably it's a pathway, probably 1 metre each side, and I think Jackie's probably right. It's just over 2 metres, but I suspect. I think it's overdevelopment of the site. I think it's visually obtrusive on the street scene, and I think it is overpowering and loss of amenity for the neighbours. I really do think it is, well, to my mind, if they wanted a 5-bedroom house, go and buy a 5-bedroom house, or a 4-bedroom house, then buy a 4-bedroom house instead of trying to stick it on a small plot and try and make it into a block of flats. I'm sorry, it is really, I was going to use the word gross, and I really don't like it at all. So sorry, I'm really sorry, Chris, but that's how I feel. Sorry.
Thank you, Councillor Oxford. Yes. Councillor Warnes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I broadly agree with the comments made. When you read the papers, it sounds marginally acceptable. But given the photographs that Chris has shown, and he said although he couldn't vouch for their accuracy, they were a reasonable representation. I think the overbearing nature of the two-story extension on the back is what I've got concerns with. I would have been more happier with a more broader single-story extension across the back, because it would have at least been baffled by the 6-foot boundary fence. But the height of that two-story and the large size of the windows also gives me concern, and I'd like to see smaller windows at the back. I agree with Robert's suggestion that the permitted development rights ought to be removed, and I think Gerard's right, really, that this in its final sum amounts to an overdevelopment of the site, and yeah, it does sit uneasy with me. Thank you.
Thank you. I have to say, for my own part, I agree wholeheartedly with everything that's been said. I have actually been quite concerned about the proportionality of the extension and the development in relation to the size of the plot. And I know Chris says, well, it's actually 24 feet to the rear garden. Well, it's hardly, it's hardly a vast garden by any standards. Chris, anyway, I think perhaps on a technical basis, we may be in some difficulty in refusing it. But having said that, I'm also minded that the committee is fairly unanimous in its concerns about it. Chris, would you care to address some of those concerns, please? You're muted.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I think whatever I say is probably not going to make a lot of difference now, to be honest. But just to reiterate that I think in design terms, an impact on the street scene, it's very difficult to refuse it on those grounds because of the fact that at the front, I think it blends in relatively well, and on the back is not obtrusive. So I don't think there's a case in design terms. I think residential amenity is the key issue, and it does meet our standards, but nevertheless, these extensions, they do have impact upon the neighbours, and that's why we have standards to see what those impacts are. And it is always a bit of a shock when a neighbour does an extension where you could previously see the sky and you now can't. So, that it will impact on the neighbour. It does meet our standards, but nevertheless, there is a case to be put forward about impact on residential amenity. And I think that's what you would have to hang your hat on if you're going to recommend refusal of it. The impact on the neighbours to the side. I think the rear window issues could be overcome, with either obscure glazing or reduce the size of the window or planting. So if that was the only issue, I think that could be overcome. But I think, it is really the key issue of impact on that side neighbour. I think overdevelopment per se is probably difficult to argue because of the size of the plot. It is a big plot and you've still got more garden space left than the standards require. And this is going to be a 4-bedroom property, and you've still got a significant amount of extra garden beyond the standards. So I think actual specific overdevelopment is a bit problematic to argue and would probably have difficulty on appeal. Parking spaces, again, extra bedrooms can increase parking, but it does meet the standards, 2 parking spaces retained. So again, on appeal, we would struggle on that point. But I think it really does depend upon whether you think it's overbearing on the side neighbour. But I think that's the key thing. So yeah, that's all I can really say on that. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chris. I think given the sentiments of the committee, sorry, Councillor Davidson, please.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to apologise to Mr. Harden, but the measurements I took were from Mrs. Norris's statement at the beginning of the meeting. That's where I got the 14 foot and the 12 foot from. But forgive me, Mr. Harden, if we could go back to that plan drawing showing the red lines, there are 5 bedrooms because the extension on the eastern side has got an extra bedroom. So is the plot large enough for a 5-bed, and are there enough parking spaces for 5-bed?
I don't know if Rich is going to show the drawing.
Yeah, I'm just getting on it.
I think yes, Chairman, the existing is basically a 3-bedroom. I discussed it with the applicant today on site. Existing is 3-bedroom with a large ensuite, and the extra room is to provide the 4th bedroom. Even so, there isn't a delineation between 4 and 5 bedrooms in terms of amenity space and parking. So, it doesn't really make a difference, but the applicant is clear that it is a 4-bedroom, with the ensuite.
Chairman, with due respect, on that drawing, those bedrooms are numbered master bedroom, bedroom 2, bedroom 3, bedroom 4, and the annex bedroom, which they are proposing to build.
Chris, do you have a reply?
Not really. No. I think the annex bedroom, let's have a look, that's the one at the front, isn't it?
Forgive me, no, the annex is the rear extension. It's got the bed in the drawing with a small window.
Yeah, I mean, that's the small annex bedroom for the child, basically.
Yes, sorry, Chairman, I wasn't trying to make hard work of
No.
it. All I was asking was, is there enough amenity space for a 5-bed and enough parking for a 5-bed? Because there are 5 bedrooms, whether they use them or not.
Well, yeah, Chairman, as I said, it doesn't make a difference in terms of the standards. They are still the same for 4, to 5 bedrooms. So it exceeds the standards in terms of amenity space by, some 60 square meters. And it doesn't make a difference in terms of parking standards. So, whether it's deemed as a child's bedroom, an ensuite, etc., it doesn't make any difference.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Could we leave the shared screen, please? Thank you. In the light of the committee's reservations, I would like to seek Simon's advice on whether a deferral would be a practical way forward on this one. Simon, would you care to talk to us about that?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, I mean, I can appreciate members' concerns. I can appreciate that there is a perception of overbearing, of an overbearing relationship with the neighbouring properties, and a perception of overlooking, given the very large window on that rear gable. What you could do, you could request that officers go away and negotiate a revision to the scheme to either reduce the size and or introduce some obscure glazing on that window. Alternatively, I note Councillor Davidson's suggestion that a handed scheme be investigated. We can do all of those things if members wish it to be so. We're obviously happy to undertake further negotiations on the scheme. I can understand the arguments around the perception of overlooking. I can appreciate the members and neighbours' concerns in that regard, regardless really whether it breaches our policy, given that it's sort of 24 feet from the rear boundary and a very substantial window. I can appreciate those concerns, and we could negotiate changes to the scheme to try and mitigate those concerns on your behalf. So if you would like to move a deferral, we can go back and negotiate on that, and you can decide whether you wish it to come back for further consideration by this committee chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard?
Yes, Chairman.
Richard, we need to put this to a formal vote?
Yes, Chairman. You
Right.
need to consider the reasons on which you want to defer and the further information you need, and I suggest you put that to a formal vote. I'd also just point out, Chairman, I think Karen Syret has raised her hand too.
Karen, please.
It feels as though the moment has passed somewhat. I was just going to clarify something that was mentioned quite some time ago about percentages of new build on properties, and it was actually, that dates back to 2004, and there was a 33% limit, but only in countryside areas, so it wouldn't apply to this area. So I've clarified that, but its time has moved on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right. Now, do I have a proposer and do I have a seconder to defer? Councillor McLean?
Yeah, I'll second it. Yeah.
To defer it, but it must come back to committee. I don't want it to go
yes.
to delegated powers.
Oh, yes.
Too many of that.
And it's to reduce the size as well, to go away to reduce the size and scale.
On the grounds of size and scale, proportionality.
And possibly of what Robert Davison said about swapping the sides.
That would come under the heading of all possible alternatives. Right. So do I have a proposer to defer on those grounds? Councillor McLean, and seconded by Councillor Loveland.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do we need to have a formal roll call, Richard?
Yes, you do, Chairman.
All right. Jan, if you'd like to read our names out.
So, Councillor Barton.
Right, I'm voting for deferral and coming back to the committee. Yes? Yep, agreed. Yeah. 4, sorry, 4.
Okay, Councillor Chua.
Yeah, 4, please.
Councillor Davidson.
4.
Councillor Hazel.
4.
Councillor Loveland.
4.
Councillor McLean.
4.
Councillor Oxford.
4, but it also has to be about negotiating reduction in the size and scale, as well as into
I think
that
we've covered
deferral.
that.
Okay,
We said
just making
size.
sure.
I've got size, scale, proportionality, and possible alternatives.
Cool. That's
Yeah?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Councillor Oxford 4. Councillor Warnes.
4.
Thank you. That's carried, Chair.
I'd also like to say 4.
Oh,
as
so
well.
Councillor Liddy, yeah. 4. Did
Right.
it again. Apologies.
That's all right.
Insignificant.
You're all sweetness. Right. Now, if it's safe to move on to the next item, which is the interim planning scheme of delegation. Karen, would you like to talk to us about that, please?
Thank you. This, I'm only going to say a few words because the last meeting you discussed the interim arrangements, but a couple of matters have come up, including the one tonight, which was a call-in, and the recommendation in the report is that all applications where members do call in an application should be considered by this virtual committee rather than under the interim delegated powers. So I think you've probably seen the sense of doing that tonight. So I will leave you to make the decision, but happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Councillor McLean, please.
Thank you, Chair. That's all very well, Karen. Thank you very much for that. But not all of us get to see the planning applications who've got problems with computers and everything. So I've had a terrible time with mine, and I don't seem to see everything. I don't get all the agendas, and if I don't see these applications, I can't call them in. I'm trying to stream. I'm relying on the residents to come to me, or so I'm a bit worried how we can sort of get around this. I think it's an IT matter, but I need some help with it. I need to get some action in my terminology, please, because I'm just a bit worried with it all.
I think that is a matter. Karen, could you arrange for someone in IT to contact Councillor McLean?
Yep, certainly.
Yeah.
Richard's already on it.
Oh.
Richard Clifford, but it's just I haven't heard from anybody. That's all.
Okay, Councillor McLean, we'll take that away. As you know, I have been liaising with our IT around this, so I wasn't aware you hadn't heard further. So I'll take that away.
Thank you. Councillor Barton, please.
Yes, thank you. I think we've got to be clear. There's got to be a time scale, though. Otherwise, officers can't work. You can't work without those parameters. You've got to have a time scale. Once you want to call it in, that makes it's pretty obvious to me. We can't work otherwise. That's all.
Thank you, Lynn. I think the existing timescale is 25 days from memory. So if that seems to work.
Yeah.
I think possibly what does happen is that members may not actually care to call in an application, but then once the neighbours are yellow carded, they do. And by then, of course, the time limit is almost expired or has passed. So I think we have to be a little bit flexible about that, or exercise some discretion. Are there any other questions or queries? Councillor Hazel, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, I agree with the fact that if a member calls it in, these applications ought to come to full committee. If apart from that, we keep to the scheme of delegation as it is now, I think we should put a time limit on it for review for 3 months. I don't think we should go beyond before we look at this again, because I really feel we should be having full planning committee meetings, whether by Zoom or in person. I accept the difficulties we have at the moment, COVID, but I do think we need to put a limit on this. And like Councillor McLean, I too have trouble with the software, particularly with colchester.gov.uk. I couldn't get the Teams meeting for the pre-meet yesterday because the site wouldn't let me in. So again, there are gremlins in the colchester.gov.uk system, and I too need to speak to IT to see what can be done to iron that out for me. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Hazel, when you talk about limits, what sort of limits are you talking about?
Well, if we agree this evening to that all called in applications will come to committee, other applications that will come under the scheme of delegation to the spokespersons, we could allow that, but just for 3 months, and then review that decision in 3 months' time, depending on the circumstances with the pandemic and so on. Because I would like to see a return to full planning committee for each application going forward as soon as we can.
The scheme of delegation will be reviewed in May anyway with the new council, so that is just a little bit over 3 months away. Okay, then, are there any other questions or queries? I mean, are we content to accept the officer's recommendation here?
Yes, Chairman.
Yeah, Councillor Davison has his hand raised, and Councillor Oxford.
Sorry, I do beg your pardon. Councillor Davison, please.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, just really supporting your own comments about the flexibility over the 25 days on the basis that if members call it in, it has to have a material planning reason to call it in. And actually, you know, the 35 days would give us plenty of time, but 25 will be awfully tight if people are away for a 14-day holiday or a 21-day holiday. So I'd like to see more flexibility on that. And I also support Councillor Hazel's, or even, sorry, Chairman, your suggestion that the annual meeting in May, if that's when you're going to review it. The problem is if elections are changed, will we have that annual meeting?
Well, we did last year. So I've got Councillor Oxford followed by Councillor Barton, please. No? Okay.
Right, yeah,
Councillor
yes,
Barton.
hi, thanks, Chairman. I was going to suggest about June for review, but as it's already down for May, I'd like to leave it at May, although I've just, you know, picked up on what Robert has said, in that, you know, if the elections are moved or postponed till next year or whatever, then will we have a May annual meeting still? We did last year, didn't we?
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that would still take place. So I think May would be fine.
Well, as I understand it, all the appointments for chairs and committees expire in May anyway.
Yeah, so they'd have.
So they would have to be renewed at that point.
Yes, that's what I was
Or
thinking.
not, yes.
There will be an annual meeting like last year. There was one, but it was a Zoom one, wasn't it?
And also, we didn't appoint the mayor either.
No, we did that later.
That was one bit that was omitted and done later.
Yeah, we did that a little bit later.
Okay, then. So within those qualifications and parameters, are we happy to accept the officer's recommendation?
Karen would like to speak, Chair.
Karen, please.
Thank you. Just to confirm, it's this committee that decide that the report will come to in May. It doesn't matter whether there's a full council meeting in May or not. This committee will decide the scheme of delegation. So that will go ahead in May anyway.
Right. Thank you very much. We will need a formal resolution. Do I have a proposer, please?
Yes.
Councillor McLean, seconded Councillor Oxford. Jan, would you care to call the school roll, please?
I will. Councillor Barton.
4.
Councillor Chua.
4.
Councillor Davidson.
4.
Councillor Hazel.
4.
Councillor Loveland.
4.
Councillor McLean.
4.
Councillor Oxford.
4.
Councillor Warnes.
4.
And Councillor Liddy.
4.
Thank you. That's carried, Chair.
That's carried. And I believe that concludes the business for this evening. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure to see you all. And
don't overdo it.
I thank the officers as well for their hard work. And so the meeting is now closed. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Stay safe,
everybody.
Safe journey back to your armchairs.
Yeah. Bye, everybody. I'll move to a different room.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Simon, if you could just thank Chris. He made a very good presentation. Thank you.
Leave.
Hi, Jan, do you want to stop the stream?
I will do. Sorry.
Well, there we go.